Hey there, and welcome to a special bonus episode of Blockchain 2025. Today we have Taylor Pearson. He's a thought leader in alternative education, famous for the book The End of Jobs, which I read and love, alternative entrepreneurship, how to be a successful freelancer and adjust to the information age, and has a natural fit because he's into blockchain and is becoming a thought leader there. He writes these amazing long-form essays, and one in particular that stood out to me is called The Blockchain Man. The future life where the individual is empowered and using blockchain tech, among other technologies, careers and lifestyles are transformed. I hope you enjoy the show.
You're listening to Blockchain 2025. The future is right now. Every week, we explore implications of the technology underpinning cryptocurrencies, blockchain.
Each episode is a standalone examination of one industry broken into 3 segments: a basic overview, blockchain's disruptive impact, and relevant crypto projects.
Blockchain 2025 is part of the Bitcoin.com podcast network. Learn about Bitcoin, create a wallet, and buy your first Satoshis all at Bitcoin.com.
Taylor, man, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, and Taylor, so first off, for listeners that aren't familiar with you, tell us about The End of Jobs, your first book.
Sure. So, I wrote a book, came out in 2015, called The End of Jobs. And the sort of like phenomenon I was interested in was these sort of like micro internet businesses, that this thing that I sort of didn't know existed when I was going through college and traditional education was this idea of one of the opportunities, the career opportunities that the internet opened up was you have sort of 2 kinds of internet businesses. One are these like huge platform businesses, which are in the press, like Google, Facebook, Amazon, et cetera. But you also have this phenomenon of basically niche businesses, which are able to leverage the very, very low distribution cost of the internet to reach a very small number of people that are very interested in a topic. So, niche e-commerce brands on Amazon, right? For people that are really into, a certain type of pillow or whatever. Something where you couldn't have had a traditional retail store in Baltimore because there's just not enough people in Baltimore that are into this. But if you can sell to the entire United States or the entire world, right, it opens up all these sort of opportunities. So one of the examples I gave in the book is a woman who did songs for sailors. So she recorded sailing songs for people that were on sailboats and were into sailing music. And that wasn't your record store was never going to stop sailing CDs because there's never enough people in whatever Baltimore to go buy sailing CDs. But if you distribute on the internet, all of a sudden it's a viable business. There's enough people around the world that are into sailing that will buy her MP3s. And so the book is sort of looking at that phenomenon. So why did that happen? What is it about the internet that made that possible? And then what is that is sort of a career script or a life script. How do people start these sorts of businesses? How do these businesses work? How do you run one of these businesses?
Yeah, for sure. And it's quite interesting. The Facebook, the Mark Zuckerbergs and Elon Musk, and for good reason, right? And Steve Jobs, they get a lion's share of the press. So I think just raising awareness for this type of micro entrepreneurship that didn't exist maybe even 15 years ago is pretty important. I would venture to say, that's been an important part of your career, kind of building awareness. And I think you've developed quite a following because of these principles and concepts you talked about in The End of Jobs.
Yeah, I think it's intuitively appealing for a lot of people that all of a sudden you have just this new interesting career path, a way that you can earn a good income and build a good living doing something that you're interested in. That also has a lot more lifestyle flexibility. Obviously, that's one of the big incentives here, that you have more control over your time and your schedule and your income.
For sure. And Taylor, I don't have any stats here. And you know how we kind of have that psychological bias where it's if all of your friends are into Bitcoin, you think everyone's into Bitcoin, but it's still, 0.1%. In terms of this digital nomadic freelance lifestyle, have you seen any stats on this?
I have, and I'm trying to, off the top of my head, I don't know how many of them I can think of. There's a reporter, a woman named Elaine Pofelt, who has a book on this, and I think she writes a column for Forbes, and she has a lot of good data and research. If someone's interested in that, you can look up her stuff. But generally, if you look at macroeconomic statistics, entrepreneurship on the whole is trending down in terms of new business formations. How they measure that is trending down pretty consistently over the last 20 or 30 years. And so you don't see it show up in like those sort of like at least like US level population statistics. Freelancing is like significantly up, as you'd expect. It's really hard. There's no data that I've seen that really parses out sort of like Uber driver freelancing to like what you would call like something more like small business ownership, where you're not necessarily working for a platform, but you're sort of leveraging that platform. Like you have a niche pillow brand on Amazon or whatever. There is the most sort of like compelling data, and this is what Elaine Pofeld's book is about, is if you look at individuals earning, say, over $200,000 or over $500,000 a year, those numbers are trending up very consistently. And the sort of most likely explanation from her research is that you have all these people who are able to start these businesses where they have a lot of operating leverage and they can use sort of piece together contractors without having any full-time employees and run these things. And that's sort of the most compelling data, but it's sort of like a macro level. I think it's still a pretty small niche phenomenon.
For sure. Yeah, I tend to agree there with the digital nomads. It's still being quite small. And there's such a fine line between, freelancer and small business owner, especially when you form an LLC. And it's also kind of interesting because we always focus on the top 0.1%, like the rich are getting richer. I think there's some valid concerns there when I'm talking, the number of billionaires, right? But it seems that internet revolution has allowed a lot of people to go from the middle class or lower middle class to very high top 5% in the United States income of $200,000 a year.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, these businesses are unique. When I talk to sort of like traditional finance guys, the term they always use is operating leverage. That, if you're selling something on Amazon, like it's very conceivable that, in 2 years you could build a business making $500,000 in revenue working 10 hours a week. And like that's very atypical, right? That's sort of like leverage where you have, relatively little time input, but you're able to generate a lot is sort of only possible because of computers effectively, right? Like automation, that all of a sudden you can do a lot of these tasks with software that's way cheaper than having to hire someone to do them. And so it opens up all these sort of new business opportunities.
For sure. Well, I think that comes down to, it's a very Wall Street term, like operational leverage, right? Or operating leverage. But it really just comes down from, I think, the godfather of digital nomads and Tim Ferriss and what he said in the 4-hour work week, right? How much money are you making per hour? And you can make a lot of money per hour with a low minimum of hours required to get that. But yeah, man, this whole episode, I think it's going to tie together nicely. The end of jobs. And you went on to do some consulting work, all sorts of cool stuff, and great writing. And we'll link to all this in the show notes. But you wrote this, I wouldn't call it a blog post. It's closer to an ebook in terms of length than a blog post. It's a monster and it's really good, called The Blockchain Man. To give some context, there's a lot of interesting concepts here, but it starts out with the 1930s organizational man, the white guy living in the burbs and the beautiful suburbia, gets in his car, drives to work. Wife stays at home, goes and works, comes home, works for the company, stays at the company for 40 years. I want to start from this piece a little bit further ahead. Most people listening to this probably haven't read the piece. So I want to start with the modern organizational man. So Taylor, can you sketch a picture of this modern organizational man?
And the people in the houses all went to the university where they were put in boxes and they came out all the same. And there's doctors and lawyers and business executives and they're all made out of ticky-tacky and they all...
Yeah, so kind of the idea with the piece is, I was thinking about, there's a line from Marshall McLuhan, who was sort of a media theorist-y guy in, I think, like the 60s and 70s. It was, first we shape our tools, then our tools shape us. And so we, and you see this now, like, all the sort of blowback with Facebook and all this, like that's sort of happening now, right? Like first we made Facebook and now all of a sudden we're starting to see the ways in which that's impacting society. And so the idea of the sort of modern organization man is that we go through these sort of the $2 word or $5 word is sort of techno-economic paradigms, right? But like the Industrial Revolution, or sometimes you split up in sort of the first, second Industrial Revolution. So you have these new technologies like railroads or steam power, and that sort of has this like long follow-on effect that ends up sort of like moving down society. So like when you have railroads, all of a sudden you also need like accurate clocks in time zones because the railroad has to go from New York to Denver, and it's going to stop along the way. And you need to be able to tell people, you need to have your livestock at the train station by 2:20 p.m. And everyone needs to agree on when 2:20 p.m. is so you can get there on time. So you have these, first we made railroads, and then all of a sudden now we need time zones. And so I think what kind of happened with the organization man was sort of the final stage of the Industrial Revolution. A lot of the technologies that came in like the late 1800s were very built around this idea of like economies of scale, right? Like Henry Ford and sort of their factory in Dearborn, Michigan is sort of like the pinnacle of this. That all of a sudden you could take things which had been historically manufactured relatively inefficiently in sort of like an artisanal way, right? You had people in their homes that were like making their own clothes, like all these things were done much more locally.
And Taylor, I want to add something. This was like pre 9 to 5, right? The 9 to 5 didn't really exist yet, that idea.
Right. This is, I think, 1870, something like 80% of Americans were farmers, basically.
Okay.
So there's no, basically, it's all agricultural. And so you went through this era where all of a sudden you could produce these things really effectively. And there was a huge amount of like latent demand that it's like, oh my gosh, I can buy clothes for 5 times cheaper than I can locally because all of a sudden we have all these economies of scale and we can do these things efficiently. And so there was sort of this dichotomy where you could either participate in the organization. You could, over the course of the 20th century, you could start to join the organization, and that gave you access to these global markets and economies of scales, which is a huge quality of life boost. If you grew up on a rural farm in, the southeast United States in, the 30s, 40s, 50s, and you became sort of like a middle manager at, Johnson & Johnson or P&G or whatever, your life relative to, your income, your quality of life relative to your parents' quality of life was much, much higher because you had access to sort of these global markets and these economies of scale through the organization. So, we shape our tools and then our tools shape us. So, we sort of built these organizations for, because they were economically profitable. But then the book you mentioned, The Organization Man by William White, that came out in the 50s, was sort of looking at now how has the organization shaped us. So you look at like, you mentioned suburbs. Like the suburbs were not a thing. I think 50s were when like sort of the first suburbs were being built, that you'd have these sort of like more or less cookie cutter subdivisions of 300 houses. And each house, was more or less the same. And, everyone in that worked for one of 3 different companies because the office was, 5 minutes away and the grocery store and da-da-da-da. And so sort of the thing I started thinking about with the article is I was reading the Organization Man book, and I was thinking about, what happens when blockchains are like organizations? What happens when blockchains are like a fully mainstream thing, 50 years from now? And what does that look like in terms of people's social lives and the rest of society?
For sure. And I want to bridge here. Great summary there, by the way. But I want to, before we get into the blockchain man, I want to take like another storytelling look at the modern organizational man, because it's still today. And I think you kind of made this point in the end of Jobs. A lot of people are hanging on to the idea of the organization man, when they should be thinking about, we'll get into the blockchain man, whether or not it's the blockchain man, but kind of like the micro entrepreneur, more sovereign individual. And it's kind of like that, there's still that go to college, get a job, get your MBA, work on Wall Street, work for the same type of corporate consulting, things like that are still profitable right now. And I don't want to say, one, that you can't do that, there's not some good stuff there, but it seems to be overall kind of overrated, and there's less awareness of this kind of freelance micro-entrepreneur businesses with Taylor in the Philippines, me in Colombia, Dan in Austin, Texas, and kind of that style of entrepreneurship. Because a lot of people think that venture capital is the only way. So tying all that back together, I think the modern organizational man has that mindset that it's kind of like a rule. You have to go to college. You have to work. You got to play by the rules. I think thought-wise, looking at something like Bitcoin or blockchain, it seems risky. I guess to be fair, the modern organizational man will say, Bitcoin, no, but blockchain's great, like referring to private blockchains, even if they're not aware, right? I mean, that's my take on the modern organizational man.
Yeah.
Feel free to disagree or add.
So I think people have a tendency to think statically rather than dynamically. And so like these, the discussion about college, right? Is college good or is college bad? And like the answer is it depends.
Sure.
And it depends on like a lot of different factors. And so I think one of the sort of overlooked or underappreciated factors is just like supply and demand. And so take like law school as an example, as that's usually like my favorite sort of battering horse. But if you went to law school in the 70s, you get a law degree for, I don't know, $3,000, $5,000. So it was like, if you didn't really know what you wanted to do with your life, you could like kind of go hide out in law school and like get a pretty valuable thing. And it like wasn't that big of a, you're going to leave with like $5,000 in debt, which was like not a trivial amount of money, but not like, people now that leave with $250,000 in debt, which, even if you adjust for inflation is like dramatically more. And so I think what we see happening, the stat that comes to mind is from 2000 to 2010, there were more college graduates than there were from 2000 to the beginning of history.
For sure.
Right? So you saw this huge up ramp in terms of supply. I mean, there's like a classic law of supply and demand here. As if demand stays fixed or increases slowly and supply goes up dramatically, then the value of whatever that thing is going to go down. Right? Supply is increasing faster than demand. So I think with a lot of this sort of these organization man scripts, like it's not that there's anything wrong with getting an MBA or getting a law degree or whatever. It's just that, well, statistically, or the data indicates that the cost of those things is going up. Secondary education is getting more expensive, and it appears that maybe with the exception of sort of like probably the top Ivy, if you get a Harvard law degree, it's like probably still worth it. But outside of sort of like these very, very top institutions, the value of those things is declining. So do you want to buy something for which the cost is going up and the value is going down? And maybe, if you have a specific thing, like you really want to do this type of law and your family has a law office, and sure, like there's tons of reasons where it makes sense, but it's not quite the same. I think people have sort of the same feeling. And I think that people get this from sort of their parents or mentors that, my dad's friend went to law school in the 70s and it like worked out well for him. The situation is very different today.
For sure. And you hate to see when parents with good intentions don't let their kids take this unconventional route, don't let them drop out of college. I think they have to take the route that would have been the move to make in 1970, but not anymore. And good point. I mean, it's worth stressing just how, the cost of education keeps going up, but wages stay stagnant. And you mentioned this in the article about the organizational man. I have a personal connection to this because you mentioned that, ironically, well, of course, organizations got bigger and bigger, but the real renegades, the people that pushed society along in the industrial age, were kind of atypical men in the organization, usually men, some women, but being that they were kind of like the loner scientists at places like Bell Labs, which was kind of like the Google of today. And so my grandpa was one of those loner scientists at Bell Labs.
Oh, cool.
He was there for like 40 years. Yeah. And he worked, he was an electrical engineer. He kind of had his own division and kind of did his own thing for a long time. But I just think it's interesting how that even in this organizational man, 70 years or however long it was, or maybe longer, it's still those kind of eccentrics that really push the needle. Yeah,
I think there was always, this is my understanding based mostly on the White's book, but there's always this tension within the organization between, the organization man knew they needed the scientist, and likewise the scientist knew they needed the organizational man to sort of run the machine. But there's like a real culture mismatch there, that sort of the thing it kept to keep the organization running, and like the focus on belongingness and fitting in, and sort of the scientists or the sort of R&D types that were actually developing a lot of the products had very different worldviews.
And Taylor, question, have you heard of Carl Sagan?
I have, yeah.
Man, maybe we'll play a clip on the show. If not, I'll link into the show notes here. Dude, so Carl Sagan, there's this really great clip of him in 1991, and he just talks about scientists and how it's not just science as in life sciences, physics, chemistry fields, but it's a way of thinking, and how politicians have no idea. They're just not aware of what's happening in science, and they're not assimilating that accurately into the decisions they're making, and it's a ticking time bomb. And he said this in 1991. And so it's fascinating to me because the one thing I highlighted from the blockchain man and just bringing this all together, Carl Sagan, just, futurist, brilliant mind, predicting this, as well as Sovereign Individual, another book we've talked about on the show that has a pretty big influence on this essay, is that nation states to play a diminished role. So for someone that just got into this podcast and like, oh man, Matt's talking about these libertarian rants again, from Taylor, the nation states to play a diminished role. Can you give a little bit of context to that and how it relates to blockchain?
Yeah, so I think on sort of a long time scale macro level, you look back and like the nation state is like a relatively novel thing. The Treaty of Westphalia is sort of the classic like start of the modern nation state. date, which I'm going to get the date. I want to say it's like 1546. I could be wildly wrong, but I think it's like that's ballpark the right area. And so this like idea of nation states in my mind is like very tied into this sort of like industrial revolution phenomenon where you had sort of these large nation states, like the history of the British East India Company is like really interesting in this regard, right? Like they were able to become this very, very powerful corporation because they were partnered with this very powerful nation state which could control the shipping lanes. And so they had this monopoly over, the British East India trade as sort of basically a cabal or, just an agreement with the British government. And if you look at the way a lot of like modern corporations act, it's like not radically dissimilar to that. Like lobbying, whatever, all these kind of things, right? Like oftentimes you have they end up forming these, cost plus Lockheed Martin defense contracting where they charge, they take the Air Force lieutenant that makes $60,000 a year out to $1,000 dinners and sell him, huge, $2,000 toilet seats and, aircraft that no one needs and all that kind of stuff. And so I think the nation state and the corporation were both sort of solving a similar coordination problem, that all of a sudden, as you saw like globalization start to ramp up and the economic benefits of that, being able to coordinate that was really, really valuable. And the only way to do that was in like a pretty centralized fashion, that you needed to, you needed your company to be in a nation state that had, like law, like a good court system and law and order and, the right global trade treaties so that you could conduct business in all these other countries. And so those two were sort of together. And so if you start to think about what public blockchains do is they solve coordination problems, right? That if I have a Bitcoin and I send it to you, you can be sure that you have that Bitcoin without needing some trusted third party to rely on or to know that that happened. And so, you can start to see a world in which at least like meaningful parts of what nation states and corporations have done can be done in a more decentralized way. So yeah, you can start to imagine a world where the nation state and the corporation and the coordination problems they're solving, they become increasingly less important in that role. And you have public blockchains that are able to start to serve some of those functions. And so they become more redundant, and you get some sort of cycle of pressure from nation states trying to outlaw or ban them, regulate them in some way, and then you end up with some sort of regulatory arbitrage where people will move to other countries to do this. You sort of create this spiral where either nation states have to be very accepting of this, or you get into these sort of competitive pressures where now nation states are competing with each other because you don't. The example I always think of is if you were Henry Ford and you had a factory in Dearborn, Michigan, and Congress passed some law you didn't like, you couldn't like pick up your factory and like move it to Bermuda. Like the factory was in Dearborn, Michigan, and there was a lot of fixed cost involved in setting that up. Where if you run a software company and something happens you don't like your ability to get on a plane and go somewhere else and just take the server with you, or it's probably in a cloud server now, right? Just move the legal entity to some other country.
Or decentralized file storage on the blockchain soon, right?
Right, exactly. Becomes all of a sudden that's very, very feasible.
For sure. And so I want to add a couple of things there. One is, I think nation states, there's going to be, I think Singapore, Estonia, Belarus, some of the Caribbean nations, and the state of Wyoming, who's doing a great job on blockchain legislation in the United States. But I think that the nation state is going to start to diminish in power. And the ones that try to, we'll say, play not to lose, similar like football analogy, right? Like try to keep their lead, these nation states. Because, hey, the blockchain man, a lot of people don't want the blockchain man and for self-interest, and it makes sense, right? But I see that it's a tough argument, Taylor, for me to put to people saying like, the federal government's continuing to get bigger. Every presidency, it seems like the federal government keeps getting bigger and bigger. And we need it less and less because of technology, paradoxically. So playing not to lose, which is from football, it's about trying to protect your lead, maintain your advantage, as opposed to being innovative, risky, and aggressive in trying to win. And I love from Skin the Game, from Taleb, I know you're a big fan of him. Side note, just about like everybody that comes on my show, it's much easier to macro bullshit than to micro bullshit, which I think is a really cogent point, and I think that's nation states. You just think the big centralized federal government, it's more micro economies, whether those are, micro companies or micro sovereignty, meaning that just smaller localities working together and solving problems.
Yeah, and I think, I guess one, you need less people to solve these problems. Now, I think, one of the scenarios I've been thinking about, which is sort of problematic, is sort of like nuclear arms control was effective because the resources required to do it were so vast that there were only ever 10 to 20 players. The number of nation states that own nukes now, I think it's something between 10 and 20.
Okay.
We're sort of this next generation of technology. If you outlaw stem cell research or some sort of bio research, you really only need 8 smart guys and not that much money to figure out a lot of these problems. And so it's going to be much harder to control in that way. And so, the flip side is, that's equally true for good things, right? If you're trying to do something, some sort of technology use case, we stick with the bio thing, you're engineering some new biotechnology which could save many lives, but the regulators in certain countries don't like it. It's easier than ever to sort of set that up somewhere else. That trend will continue to be the case.
That's for sure. There's a downside to everything. And a lot of just new technologies is you improve efficiency, you advance society with the technology, and you spend the next 20 years trying to solve the either a lot of times unintended side effects of that new technology. So Taylor, I think this is it, man. This is the moment. Walk us through the blockchain man.
Yeah, so as we've been circling around this idea of first we shape our institutions, then we shape us. And we had this model in which the organization man was born of these large institutions, and so there's this real focus on, I think White called it the social ethic, this idea that you wanted to belong to the corporation, you wanted to fit in the suburb, you wanted to have the right car, the right spouse, and the right lawn, and yada yada. Whereas the blockchain man, in my mind, is much more like this loner scientist we were discussing, that the blockchain man doesn't need to serve the organization in order to benefit economically, right? He or she is serving the protocol. That if you can contribute to the protocol in a way that is beneficial, doesn't matter if you have the right haircut or if you wear the right suits or if you're in the right booster clubs or whatever, you're a public key or an avatar on a screen, and what you sort of contribute to the ecosystem is sort of the penultimate thing. So you have this this shift to sort of a focus as the individual as the source of creativity, and this much more individualistic society than what we've seen over the last 100 years.
For sure. And it's quite interesting, just the US is way more individualistic than Asia, right? Which is much more group-centered. So this blockchain man, this is another thing I liked from your essay, Taylor, is tell us about the paycheck of the blockchain man, because the organization man, 9 to 5, come home, end of every month, it's payday, right? And then you get a Christmas bonus, but it's going to be quite different in the future.
Yeah, so I think sort of one of the problems with the organization man is it was sort of a mutually advantageous thing, that if you were, an executive at a car company, you wanted to sort of play nice because there weren't a lot of competitors, right? There was 3 places you could work in the whole world. And so, maybe you were actually much smarter than the other executives and you wanted to get, double your bonus. But it didn't really make sense to ruffle a lot of feathers because you knew the organization was going to take care of you, right? You were going to get your 401k and your pension, and you were, sort of going to get paid out. So this idea of, I talk to people now and they sort of go from, organization man to, quote unquote free agent. They start freelancing or sort of working for themselves. It changes the way you think about things. So, historically, saving for retirement as well, I'm going to contribute X% of my income every month to my 401k. And then all of a sudden, when you don't have to do that and there's not some company matching problem, you start to think, maybe I should contribute that to buying a personal trainer because I know healthcare gets really expensive when you get older, and if I can stay in better shape, I can be more productive, I can make more money over the next few years, I'll be happier, and then that'll reduce my healthcare costs. So you start to think a little bit more creatively about these things because you see that there's sort of some different opportunity costs that you haven't thought to think about. And so sort of as this relates to the paycheck, the organization man, it was very hard to measure the value that was being created for a few reasons. I think one, just sort of like the nature of the techno-economic paradigm was the value was like a little bit more normally distributed, if you will. Like it wasn't that wide. If you were working on an assembly line, the difference between the guy that like put on the headlights and the guy that put on the fender, was one guy like really a lot more productive than the other one? Like probably not. But if you have two software engineers writing code, one could be literally 100 times more productive than the other one. You have this potential for this large disparity. And then you could also like measure it, right? If you build an app and I build an app and we both release it into the app store, the blockchain app store, even the iTunes app store, and yours gets 1,000 times more users than mine, like there's no debate about whose app was better.
Right.
Like it's very clear that that's the case, that yours is better. And so I think increasingly we'll sort of start to see, when you're able to track this in a relatively trust-free way, your income will be much more closely tied to whatever sort of the market value you're creating is. That if you're a user experience designer and I have a company that sells whatever niche pillows, and you come and you redesign my website in such a way that 20% more people that visit buy a pillow, or the average order value goes up, or whatever it is, there'll be a way where you can be compensated based on the value you're providing as opposed to some sort of lump sum thing. And a lot of that is sort of the measurement aspect of it, right? That right now the transaction costs with that are too high, right? Like you're not going to have your account, you're going to have to go through and you're going to, okay, well, we have to look at the analytics, and our accountant has to write you sort of this custom check every month. And it's like very messy, but you could see how all that could start to be turned into basically smart contracts, right? Where all this data is collected, we all agree on what the data is, and we all agree on the terms of the contract, and I'm just sent a payment, like a musician is for song royalties or whatever, where these many sales are registered this month, and so you get a check for this much.
So Taylor, I want to break down that answer there, because there's a few concepts in there. I mean, first off is this global marketplace. And a true global marketplace, because you mentioned there are opportunity costs. It's just not feasible. If, let's just say you live in Japan and I live in Colombia, and you're a citizen of Japan, I'm a citizen of a different country, it's still not that easy for us to form a company together, right? We might have to go to Hong Kong or Singapore. And when I say easy, it can be relatively more easy, but it's going to cost a couple $1,000s. We might have to fly there. Whereas with Aragon and governance on a blockchain, these smart contracts, we can literally set up. Taylor has this micro project. He's got a book coming out on blockchain. He wants Matt to design the cover art, and maybe you could send me this smart contract where automatically I get, if it sells over 10,000 copies because I did the cover art, I get lifetime royalties 5%. Where, especially for a self-published book, that would be like a pretty difficult contract. And so I think that's really cool. I also think that, and we talk about this all the time, is transparency. So getting all these micropayments and working together has a lot to do with the access you have, right? So now if I'm a graphic designer, I'm competing with people all over the world, because I still see this today, Taylor. It doesn't make sense to me that a web designer, assuming the client's not in New York, if there's no face-to-face meetings, if a web designer is in Argentina and they're better than the person in New York, I don't like the negotiation piece. Well, hey, you live in Argentina, right? I think it should be just based on your work. And I think we're starting to move towards that. The third thing I want to relate this all to is opacity, right? And what thrives on opacity is corruption and top-down control.
This is Roger Veer. Make sure to listen to the Humans of Bitcoin podcast, part of the Bitcoin.com podcast network. Stories from people around the world whose lives have been changed by Bitcoin. New episodes every Tuesday.
So Taylor, I think that these micropayments, going to these micropayments for a paycheck, technology is going to enable those types of things that just even a couple of years ago wouldn't even seem possible.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to watch roll out. I do think this stuff is quite a ways away, and I think the regulatory hurdles and all that are pretty significant, but it's interesting in my thinking. You can sort of always follow the logic of the technology, and it sort of trends in that direction. So I think it's pretty clear to me that this is the direction we're headed. And exactly how it plays out and exactly at what timeline is probably debatable. But this sort of increasing ability to compensate people for their wages, people will eventually demand it, and the market will eventually pay it because they can prove it's worth it.
For sure. So I think that Austrian economics, it's all based on free markets, and letting free markets decide that. So blockchain really helps almost anything that you can think possibly for work on a free market system. And that's where the individual is going to be affected.
That's sort of markets everywhere, right? Like all of a sudden you can start to see markets in places that you you never imagined markets. The idea of the basic attention token is really interesting to me, right? That there's now a market for attention. That, I can charge this much for my attention, and you can, someone could bid to see if they want to display an ad to buy that much of my attention.
Listeners, really quick, what is the basic attention token? It's a cryptocurrency by Brave. Brave is a web browser, competitor to Google Chrome. Full disclosure, I use it and I love it. It's fast and secure and blocks more ads. And it's by the founders of Mozilla Firefox and the creator of JavaScript. I mean, some really high-level people. But basically, the basic attention token is on user attention, like Taylor said. And for both publishers, those that have news and other types of blogs and websites, advertisers and users, direct interaction between everybody. And users can receive this token for opting in to see ads, which is something that doesn't happen with Google AdWords and Facebook ads. Anyway, that's what basic attention token is, and back to the show.
So I think all these things that were historically, you just couldn't make a market because you couldn't measure these things. You're going to see markets take their place.
For sure. And we did an episode on prediction markets, which to me is one of the most just sci-fi ideas, maybe even more than a decentralized exchanges. But I think, it's cool to be aware of. And Taylor, I do appreciate that. I mean, we call it Blockchain 2025 for a reason, because we know a lot of this stuff is years away. So we're more focused on the future. But yeah, man, to finish up here, Taylor, just paint the picture for people listening right now in their car, on the New York subway, wherever they are. What's a day in the life of the blockchain man?
That's a great question. I started to write a follow-up piece that was looking at that, and I haven't gotten very far with it. But I was sort of contrasting it. One of the examples I talk about in the piece is a book called Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis, which came out in I want to say it was the 30s. But it was sort of like an early look at the organization, man. It's a guy who's a real estate in some fictional town, I think of Zenith, Ohio. And, he wakes up and he puts on his, Booster Club approved watch, and he gets in his, his lawn that won the whatever Zenith Lawn Award last month. And he sort of walk through his day. Everyone at least recognizes aspects of themselves or members of their family or people they know, and sort of how that, some of the main things is there's a lot less, it's more individualistic in both sort of the good and the bad ways. The blockchain man doesn't go to the office, or the blockchain individual more, because I think it is sort of a less, gender is less of a role when everything's electronic. It's much more individualistic in the sense that, you're participating with the protocol over the network and not necessarily with other people. That there's a lot less water cooler time, sure, which gives, I think, one of the upside of sort of individualism, right, that you have a lot less that gender, race, sexual orientation, whatever, all these things start to matter less and less because it's not as much about conformity. It's much more results driven. It's much more market based. But also, we'll probably, I think, sort of loneliness, isolation, lack of a feeling of community. I think that's going to be a major issue that the sort of blockchain individual is like. I think about myself to some extent. I mostly work from home, mostly by myself, and I get on a couple calls a day. But sometimes at the end of the day, I'm like, man, it'd be nice to talk to a living human being. So I think a lot of those sort of issues around, and I think we're already starting to see this, but around community and belonging that have historically been provided by the organization in a lot of cases, right? A lot of people, a lot of my parents' friends were their friends from work, right? That was who they sort of developed these social ties with. So that trend is also really interesting to me.
For sure. It's worth mentioning, they're the downsides of the blockchain man or blockchain woman. It's dude, I've been freelance for 10 years, man. I worked at a couple of companies in college and right after college, man. And that's the one thing I miss, man. Just making jokes at the water cooler and just that camaraderie of a company is really nice. That is a true downside to those that have been freelancing for years. Sometimes you don't get out of your house for 2 days. That's a common thing. And I think you see this argument against people that are atheists, like Sam Harris, or science and blockchains may make things more efficient, and they might help us understand how the world works.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily tell us, we're social beings, how to accommodate to this technology, which can be very cold.
Yeah, I keep coming back to this. First we shape our tools, and then our tools shape us. And so I think we're doing a lot of the shaping of the blockchain technology right now, and in a few decades, that technology will be doing a lot of shaping of us. And so to the extent you can sort of think about and anticipate some of those problems, I think that's probably beneficial, right? You can sort of start to think about, how can we adjust in such a way that we get some of the upsides of this while, mitigating or managing some of the downsides.
For sure. So everyone listening now, I'd say, one, you got to read Taylor Pearson's article. Taylor, I know you got a book coming out based on this where you got a deep dive, but just think about, one, the end of jobs. We're moving more and more towards small companies, freelancing, and I think a skill stack being, having a variety of skills that can fit in and work with other people. And yeah, I think go for a walk, meditate on this information, because things are fantasy and fiction until they're not. And you don't want to be hit in the head, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. Well, hey, Taylor, this was a really fun conversation. I think like Zach O'Brien, I think we have a lot of mutual friends. This is the first time we've got to have a long off conversation. I will say one thing that I forgot to mention is that I joined the Dynamite Circle, which was a community for digital nomads, maybe 6 years ago now, 5-6 years ago. I was in there for a couple of years, precisely because I felt isolated and I was able to connect with some people who I'm friends today. And I think that's probably why we're on this call today. I think without the Dynamite Circle, I would not have had the pleasure of knowing you.
Yeah, and I think you referred to the book earlier, The Sovereign Individual. They sort of talk about historically you had these sort of I think the Knights of Malta was one of the ones they talked about, these sort of I don't even know, not industry groups, but
like the Masonry, those types of societies, yeah.
Yeah, right. These sort of it wasn't particularly controlled by one centralized entity, but this sort of semi-decentralized. Yeah, the Masons are a good example. So I think it seems like that's sort of going to be what's going to pop up, right? You're going to see some of these interest-based communities for people where they can sort of congregate around them in much the same way that they might have congregated around a company or a church or something like that historically. I don't know how well that will work. I think is an interesting open question, but that seems to be the way things are moving.
Yeah, just one of the latest episodes we did, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Gnosis, but it was a prediction marketplace by one of the ex-co-founders of Augur.
Yeah.
He's actually starting a religion on the blockchain, Omega X. It's interesting. We did a whole show on it, man. But hey, Taylor, man, thank you so much. And yeah, man, whenever you want to come on and talk about blockchain, your new book, we're happy to promote it for you. And we wish you best of luck in your intellectual journey with blockchain and everything that comes with it.
Cool. Well, yeah, I appreciate you having me on. And I'll definitely share about the book. I'd love to come back and chat about it.
Sounds great, man.
Cool.
Thanks for listening to the Bitcoin.com podcast network. To learn more about our shows, visit Bitcoin.com/podcast. Bitcoin.com podcast network.